Hey, sorry for not uploading for 6 months, but I don't know, I've just been busy. But I'm gonna talk about the age of women at marriage in the past because a lot of Muslims and pagans and other weirdos try to like say that uh, like 100 years ago or 200 years ago people married like 5-year-olds or retarded stuff like that. So hopefully I can prove them wrong. And yeah, I asked some people on Telegram. So this isn't like the general population, but like maybe it represents something kind of close to it. Maybe like a little bit more schizoid than average. But most people said between 13 and 18, basically. And then a couple, some people said 18 to 20, 20 to 25, over 25, and then 4%. Well, I guess 13% said 12 or under, which is those are the weirdos that I'm kind of making this video to debunk. But today the average age of marriage, at least in America, I think in England it's around 31 for women, 35 for men, something crazy like that. But in America it's 27 for women and 29 for men, and only 1/4 of women, 16%. Yeah, I mean sorry, 25% of women married before age 23. So really, most like people marrying are gonna be in their mid to late 20s. But then there's also data from the census in the 19th and 20th century, and so the average age for a woman to marry was 23. And there are other categories like percent married, percent single. Like those, don't worry about those. Just look at the first two columns, or rather just the second actually, because we're not going to focus on male marriage in this video. But for female marriage, in 1880, the average was 23. 1890, 24. So it varied a little bit from 23 to 24, but it basically stayed the same, right? 1920, 22 and a half. 1930, 22 and a third. 1940, almost 23. 1950, 20, 21. So it varies a little bit by a couple years, but it basically stays at early 20s. And then in 1990, it became 25. But so this is already debunking like certain things that I've seen. Like I actually read this in a book. I didn't even see like a random schizo say this. I read in a book. I believe it's Rape and Race in the 19th Century South by Diane Somerville. I think that's the name. And she says that in some southern states it was legal to have sex, or not have sex, to marry 12-year-olds, and that this was normal. But I mean, if you just look at this, in 1880, the average for a woman to get married is 23, not like 10 or 12 or whatever. And then for the 18th and 19th centuries, this is data from England. Uh, well, actually, yeah, the first table is for not southern China, rural China. And I'm not gonna read all of these, but if you just look at the last two rows where it's the mean age in Sui, which is a province of China, between 1774 and 1840, it was 20 years old, a little under 20 years old, a woman would get married. And if you look at the first couple rows, like people getting married under age 14, it was pretty uncommon. Like only 2% married before at age 10 or below. 3% marriage at age 11, sorry. So, and like under 20%, yeah, 12% of women in China married before age 15. So, and then there's also data for England, which I'll just read. The screenshot on the right. The series for both sexes show a remarkable small range of variation. The lowest figure we have for bachelors is that for 1839 through 41, 25.5 years. The highest figure that for 1899, 26.6 years. Over the same period, the average for spinsters rose only from 24.3 to 25.2. The earliest figures, however, were based on a very small sample, blah blah blah, which is true. Like it's based on marriage certificates, and those weren't very common because most people had, instead of civil marriages, they had church marriages. But even like if you look at more representative years, it's still like only 25 or 26 for women. And over half a century of profound structural change in both the economy and society appears, therefore, to have affected age of first marriage only slightly. And then if you go to 17th, 18th centuries, this is for England. What the first two screenshots are. Yeah, the first screenshot is England. It's from the same paper for England as earlier, but this is a random table the author put in the notes instead of like actual main part paper. And you can see those different. I believe those are counties, shires, whatever. And for women, it's mostly mid 20s, sometimes early 20s. Like in Sussex, I would say it's early 20s, but like 24, 25, right? Would be the normal age. And then there's the next table, which is from Higgs 1970, and it's for New England towns. Yeah, 5 New England towns, and almost nobody married like really young. I put in the bullet notes. Less than 4% of women married under age 17 in 5 New England towns, 1720 to 1760. And the median age was 21. So and the mean was 22. But and if you go to Belgium, this is for 16 1700s in Belgium. I believe these are mostly rural areas in South Belgium. I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's southern Belgium, and it's above 25, 26. Sometimes it even reaches like 27, 28. So obviously not marrying like 10-year-olds or anything, marrying like adult women. And then there's more U.S. data from colonial America, and I'm not gonna read all of these obviously, but it's like there are some parts of America where it was like 18 or 19, 20, but mostly it was just 20. And then there in like the 1600s, and in the 1700s it was around 21 or to like 23 maybe or 24. Uh, and then obviously there are exceptions like I put in the second bullet note. Some parts of Maryland are around 16th to 18th to 17th century. And there's also data in the next table for England, and France and Germany, and those are still like mid 20s, right? 26, 24, 25, 25.7. Then for the medieval ages, right? So far it's only been the early modern, right, and Victorian ages, right? So for Middle Ages, there's a paper from Hallam 1985, which estimates age of women at first marriage from 1252 to 1478. And there are two methods. I think method B is probably more accurate, but it's hard to tell because it's just kind of weird. Like basically they're using records of like when someone purchased land, and like I don't know, like it's just kind of weird, like to see like how old they were. But it's probably somewhat accurate, and it also matches other data, which I'll go into in a bit. But if you go to the average of the two methods, which is probably more accurate than any single method, I would say, even though there's a really small number of marriages that they're counting, the average is 25 over the whole period. And then in the same paper, there's also age of women at first marriage before the Black Death, which is, I believe, the like mid 1300s, early 1300s. So this will be like data from 1252 to like 1320 or 1330, something like that. And it is 24 on average in all manners if you go to the average of both methods. And then there's also from Pod 2020, which is a pretty nice paper. It looks specifically at maternal mortality, but it also has this table in it. Maternal mortality as in like percent of pregnancies that result in the woman's death. But it shows that only 6 of the, and this is like noble women, so like people who like people you can actually like look at like their biographies and like entries about them in encyclopedias. That's where this data comes from. So these are people whose lives you actually kind of know about. So like people would know if they had a pregnancy and like had a child, right? Like these are people whose lives are well documented. But only 7% of women had their first pregnancy at age 15 or younger, and the average isn't included in this table, but it includes it in the text, which I didn't include a screenshot in, and it was 20 for the average age of first pregnancy. So if you just subtract like 9 months to a year from first pregnancy to marriage, it's probably around 19. And then yeah, there's more data for the Middle Ages. This is for yeah. I'll just read this out. Subtracting the age of the oldest child from the age of the mother tells us how old these women were at the birth of their oldest surviving child. We exclude women over 30, as many of their adult children were doubtless already dead. For 14 widows younger than age 30 in the survey, the average age of which they gave birth to the first surviving child was 18.4. And I believe this is ancient Florence or some part of Tuscany, Italy. And birth of first surviving child was 18.4. So if you just subtract like around a year from that, it would be 17.4 years at first marriage. So not like 10 years old or 12 years old like some people think, but like fairly young. And of course, it's not counting like deaths births that ended in infanticide or abortion or just general infant demises or whatever, or embryo demises. Uh, and then from the same book, it says, among the patricians of the town of Frankfurt, right, Germany, the average age of 43 brides was 18.8, meaning that, they were married at around age 19 in Germany. And I believe this is for, from, I think it's around 1300s and 1400s. And then this is more data for Italy from a really good book. It's called The Tuscans and Their Families by Hirhili and Klappisch Zuber. And I'll just read the bullet points. In Italy, 1427 through 30, average age for women was 19 in both the cities and the countryside. In other parts of Italy, at different times, the age was lower, 15 or 16 in the 1300s, right? So you can see in the rightmost table, the mean age in the city of Prato in 1372 was 16.3. So that means like around half of women married before age 16. And then in countryside of Prato, instead of just the city, it was 15 in 1372. But if you look at like all the later dates, like 1400, 17.6, 17.3. And then in Florence, it was 17.6. In the 1400s, it was 17, 19, 20. So, like, again, like, kind of young by today's standards, but it's not like they're marrying children. And Italy sucked, by the way. I included this slide because, like, to show, like, because Italy data obviously deviates from English data, right? Because in Italy, there are 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds getting married, while in England, it was like 24 on average, or 23 on average during the same time period. So, Italy is, like, pretty much known for being bad. Like, in The Holy State, which is an advice book basically from the 1600s, it says, travel not beyond the Alps. And this is like in a chapter about traveling. So specifically, go wherever you want, but don't go to Italy. Mr. Ascham did thank God that he was but 9 days in Italy, wherein he saw in one city, Venice, more liberty to sin than in London he ever heard of in 9 years. That some of our gentry have gone thither and returned thence without infection. I more praise God's providence than their adventure. And then later in the same book, he's talking about prostitutes. And when he's describing the average prostitute's life, he says, she dieth commonly of a loathsome disease. I mean that disease, unknown to antiquity, created within some hundreds of years, which took the name from Naples. When hell invented new degrees in sins, it was time for heaven to invent new punishments. Yet is this new disease now grown so common and ordinary, as if they meant to put divine justice to a second task to find a newer. And now it is high time for our harlot, being grown and loathsome to herself, to run out of herself by repentance. Yeah, blah, 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 right? And then if you literally just look up Naples disease, right, because it says it took its name from Naples. If you look up Naples disease on Google, even now it says this was syphilis or grande varroa, the great pox. So, yeah. And then there's another slide where in Plain Reasons for the Growth of Sodomy in England, which is a book from, I believe it's 1728, it says, how famous, or rather how infamous, Italy has been in all ages, and still continues in the oldest odious practice of sodomy, needs no exploration. It is there esteemed so trivial, and with so modish a sin, and withal so modish a sin, that not a cardinal or churchman of note, but has his Ganymede. No sooner does a stranger of condition set his foot in Rome, but he is surrounded by a crowd of panderers, who ask him if he chooses a woman or a boy. and procured to him for him accordingly. This practice is there so general that they have little else in their heads or mouths. So then caste and at casto, which is I think it means buttocks in Italian or no in Latin, and then I don't remember what it says after that because they cut it off. But yeah, basically it's not a great country, and then because it had a bunch of sodomites even back then, and in this book Rock 1996, which is I don't remember what the name of the it's like forbidden relationship something like that, which is about homosexuality in medieval Florence. Oh, well, specifically Renaissance Florence, to prove that these sodomites are actually getting married, right? Because we all know that sodomites are pedophiles, and they were obviously the ones marrying the children. It says of the 466 passive partners who were questioned in the 478 to 1502 survey. Oh, sorry, this is I put that in to prove that sodomites back then were as evil as they are now. It's basically saying how many times they sodomized one person. It says the 387 who confessed named a total among them of 3,400 partners ish. So that probably means around like what 8 partners, 7 partners per person. And then in Appendix B of that same book, this is the percentage of them that are married. And it unfortunately doesn't show the age of their spouses, but it says that around 24% were married. And then for the full sample, and then for self-accusers, meaning people who like admitted to being sodomites, like they accused themselves in order to get someone else in trouble, around half of them, or sorry, around a quarter of them again, which is around half as much as all males in general, as you can see from the last column. But yeah, and then this one isn't really proving Italy sucked. It's just saying it's different. This is it was just a much higher wage society up until the 1700s compared to England. You can see from the building craftsman wages in between northern Italy and southern England. And yeah, they were like 50%, 60%, 30% higher up until the 1700s. So it's just not representative of Europe as a whole. And then there's also data for ancient Rome that's pretty good. It comes from Hopkins 1965, who cites, I believe it's a book from the 1800s, but I wasn't able to find the book itself. So I just have this. And I'm not going to read that, but here's the, you can if you want, but it basically just says, let me find, 16.8 or 17-ish is around the average for Christian girls, and then for pagans it was 15.5. There's a slight difference, but it's mostly just in general. Like it's not like they're marrying 2-year-olds or 5-year-olds, but even though like 15 is quite young, and that means half of them were below 15. Same with 17, but it's not like as low of an age as you would expect. And if you look at this table, only 14%, in the second bullet point I wrote, only about 14% of Christians and 31% of pagans married before age 14. So, most of them were at least like, above 14, which is, kind of normal. And that's when, according to the same book, I believe it says that 14 through 15 is around when girls had their periods, according to Roman authors. So this was so usually girls married after their first period at least. Like at least they weren't like, pedophiles in a sense that they married prepubescent children, right? They were, I don't know what it's called, ephebophile, something like that. Not that that's much better, but whatever. And then ancient China. There isn't like any quantitative data, but I found this interesting paper from 1934, which says that by the 600s AD, it was actually illegal for women not to be married by age 15. But also, it seems like no one really married before age 15. So, so it seems like, at least if this paper is correct, in 600s AD China, women would marry at exactly age 15, maybe a little less, but not more. So, like 14 and a half, 15 maybe would be a fine estimate. And then in the ancient East, so there's this paper for Roth in 1987, which couldn't find like exact data on their ages, but just looked at what percentage of their parents are alive, or sorry, fathers are alive, which is based on whether the father represented them in the marriage ceremony, marriage certificate, and stuff like that. And it says that around 36% of them, if you look at the rightmost passage, On the bottom it says, well, I guess on the second page in that passage, it says 36% ish of these women had their fathers alive when they got married. And Roth provides a table, table 8, which is basically if you assume that the age structure was the same in ancient Babylon as it was in 2nd and 3rd century AD Rome, then you could just go to the percentage of offspring having living fathers and go to 42%. That would indicate an age of offspring of around 22, maybe a little older than 22, which obviously isn't like the most accurate, but it's at least something. And then if you go to Tenney 2017, which actually did have the ages, it says, if this is the case and our workers on average entered marriageable age or were majority married at just over 23 for males and a little younger for females. So again, it's not completely exact, but it's some form of data, and it's 22, 22, 23, right, for women. So I mean that's just it's around 20, I would say, is the average age. I think that sounds fair for women in ancient Babylon. And the Tenney paper, I believe, is 1200 BC. It says in the third bullet note, and then Roth doesn't really specify. I think it's just mostly from 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries BC though. And then this is another for the ancient East. This is for Roman occupied Egypt, and this is Bagnon Friar, 1994. I think the book is called what is it? Demography of Roman Egypt, something like that, or Greek Egypt. And I drew like this little cross here, and it says around 50% of women were married at like age 18, maybe like 17.9, something like that, and only around a quarter married before age 15, and 10% before age 13. So again, most of these women were at least like past puberty or halfway through it by the time they got married. They weren't like little babies. And then I mostly included this passage from An Universal History, Book 1, because it was funny, but also it does like show that Babylon also was weird, so it might not be completely representative. They might have been married older there than in the other parts, even though with Italy, I argued that the fact they were weird means they married younger, but I don't know, whatever. And it's just like some form of deviation from the norm. And this is describing the religious practices at around the time that the Roth and Tenney data was collected, or not collected, but from where the data comes from, the time it's covering. It says, as soon as any man had commenced gallus, or eunuch priest, by dismembering himself, he ran about the city with the part in his hand, at length throwing it into some house. He thence retrieved the woman's attire, and from that time forward his life was entirely agreeable to his new dress. The eunuch priests, however, entertained a passion for women, and the women for them, which, far from being thought scandalous or pretentious, was esteemed pure and holy. Yeah, so they were like, weirdos, trannies who cut off like their penises and threw them into like random people's houses and like dressed as women. So again, like kind of weird, but I don't know like exactly if that means that the data from the last slide is wrong. And then there also might be some racial component, which is that if you look at this Haynes 1996 paper from the first couple slides, it shows the rates for age, for race. And if you look, it says for blacks, the women married at around age 20, 21, up until like the 1930s, right? And then for whites, it was usually 22 to 23 or something like that. So a little bit older, maybe 24 in 1890. So a little bit of a difference, maybe a year or two, maybe 3 years, something like that. So not too big of a deal, but a couple year difference. And then there's also Crawford 1992, which looked at basically a bunch of slaves were interviewed in the 1930s, like ex-slaves. Obviously, there weren't any slaves in the 1930s, but people who grew up as slaves in the 1930s were interviewed. And around there, and if you look at these categories, 12 through 15, 8 through 11, 4 through 7, 0 through 3. Those are the ages they were when slavery was abolished, right? Female ages in 1865. And basically, what the author wrote for Crawford 1992 is what percentage of them said that they were married at the time that slavery was abolished, and of those between ages 0 and 11, 0% said they were married in own household. And then of those 12 through 15, only 1.1%. And then if you go to the 16 through 25 category, some of them were married, but not all of them. And again, this misses some people because some people might have been married but not living on their own, obviously. But this is just a general idea that most slaves didn't marry until later, until at least like 16 to 20. And then this is Trussell and Steckel, 1978, which is the first year that mean age at which slaves gave birth, and that's 20.6. So again, you subtract a year or so, and you get 19 and a half. Which is like younger than whites, obviously. And then there's more data for whites compared to slaves, which is from a hospital in New Orleans from 1855 to 1860. And the average female, you can just say cingulate mean age at marriage. For white women, it was 24, and for slave women, it was 25.8. But also, it's possible that just that since it doesn't really align with the Haynes data, but also it's older, so I don't know like which one you'd want to go with. But I don't know. But it does match the Crawford data where until where 26 being the average makes sense because only the 20 through 25 plus categories really had many people married. But then, and then there's also a last paper in the slide, Lowenstein, 1994, which looked at Jews versus non-Jews, and I believe this is Germany, and the average Jewish wife married at 27 versus 24 in the 1800s, and then 25, 25. So like there's a slight difference, maybe 1 year, maybe 1.5 at the very most. And then there's a couple more slides, just fornication, because like when I was talking to some people about this, I showed them these data, and they said, well, people were fornicating back then, and blah blah blah, and that wouldn't account for it. But if you look at the like actual illegitimate rates, this is from Gibson 2018, and it goes down to the 1561 up to 1960, and at any given time the illegitimacy rate was under 6%. And so like it's not really a big deal, and this is a percentage of people who baptize their children while being unmarried. This, however, is people who gave birth too soon after marriage. This is the more typical definition of bastardy, and this was actually a pretty high rate, like 20% in 1560, well 22% maybe, and, at its height at around like 40-45% in England in the 1800s. But this is people giving birth too soon. So the fact that people fornicated before marriage and then got married and had children means that there isn't much of a difference between the age at first child and age at first marriage, right? Because people married, so people fornicated and married right after, meaning that the age at fornication is around the same as age at marriage, if that makes sense. And if you can go to France, France is actually surprisingly lower than England. I thought it would be higher because usually you see French people as being more degenerate, but whatever. And even their relatively low rate. Well, I mean, I guess there's no like similar data as for England to compare it to, but you would assume it's the same as England, where they fornicated, gave birth really early, but before that they got married. So this means that at the very most there's a 9-ish month gap between getting someone pregnant and marrying them, which implies less than 1 year between fornication and marriage age. So that would still mean they're not marrying children. I mean, not having sex with children. They're still like marrying people who are 18, 19-ish, right, or whatever. And then finally, this is American data, and this actually compares someone born if you get married and then give birth 9 months later to if you get married and give birth 6 months later. And 6 months means that you spent at least 3 months getting ready to marry, or just marrying, right? 9 months means that you married pretty much automatically. So within this 3 month span, it basically goes to nothing. Like, for example, in like 1660, 1670, whatever that year is, like maybe 3% gave birth less than 6 months afterward, but almost a third, maybe even over a third, gave birth 9 months or lower. So that means that almost all, maybe not almost all, but like 70-80% of illegitimate children were actually born to married parents who married less than a couple months after fornication. And I mean that's it. Like basically, fornication isn't a really good argument because it just doesn't really work when you look at the data. And these are the references. and bye.